I sat perfectly still, my coffee growing cold as her words sank in. You don't deserve a place in our home or our lives. My daughter-in-law didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. My son laughed, like it was a joke they'd shared before. After carrying him, feeding him, burying his father alone for him, I wasn't family anymore. I was furniture. They'd finally decided to move out. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The dining room shimmered with the kind of polish that came from money, not warmth. Every surface in Brian and Lana's house reflected light. The marble countertops, the silver-framed family photos, even the glass chandelier swinging faintly above the table. Helen Carter sat at the end, napkin folded neatly in her lap, watching her son's family through the soft haze of candlelight. Dinner smelled of rosemary chicken and something faintly burnt underneath. Helen had offered to help earlier, but Lana waved her off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You just relax, Helen. You've done enough cooking for one lifetime. Now, that same smile was gone. Emily sat across from her grandmother, silent, fork tracing circles in her mashed potatoes. Brian scrolled through his phone until Lana's sigh cut through the clinking of silverware. So, Lana said brightly, we've been talking about making some changes around here. Helen looked up. Changes? Lana's nails clicked against her wine glass. We're decluttering, simplifying, the whole fresh start thing. And, well, she gestured vaguely toward Helen's direction. It just doesn't make sense for you to keep that room anymore. Brian's head snapped up. Lana! She didn't let him finish. You have your pension, your car, your independence. You don't need to be here full-time. We can help you find something smaller, more manageable. Helen's fork paused midair. Are you saying you want me to move out? The silence that followed was a living thing, thick, humming, merciless. Lana leaned back, crossing her arms. Helen, it's not personal, it's practical. You've been with us 3 years. We need our privacy, our space. You don't deserve a place here anymore. The words landed like a cold slap. Across the table, Emily flinched. Brian gave a small, strangled laugh, the kind he used when he didn't want conflict. Come on, Lana, that's... But she turned to him sharply. Don't pretend you disagree. You said yourself it's been difficult. Helen's eyes found her son's, searching for the boy who once begged her to read one more bedtime story. But there was nothing there now, just a man staring down at his plate. She placed her fork carefully beside her napkin. If that's how you both feel, she said quietly, I'll gather my things tonight. Mom, don't be dramatic, Brian murmured. Helen stood smoothing her cardigan. Her voice was soft, but it filled the room. Dramatic would be begging to stay. For a moment, no one moved. Then Emily rose, as if to speak. But her mother's glare froze her mid-breath. Helen reached for her purse and keys from the counter. The sound of metal against granite seemed to echo longer than it should have. At the door, she looked back once. Brian had his hand on Lana's shoulder, and Lana, satisfied, composed, was already clearing plates. Emily's eyes met hers, wide and wet. Helen gave her the faintest smile, one meant to say, It's all right, don't lose yourself in their noise. Outside, the night air was crisp, smelling faintly of pine and the faraway hum of highway lights. She stood on the porch, the laughter from inside, muffled now, replaced by the quiet rhythm of her own heartbeat. Her car door creaked as she opened it. Inside, the dashboard clock read 8:47 p.m. Her reflection in the windshield looked older than she remembered. Tired, yes, but not broken. She started the engine and drove down the winding suburban street, past the houses trimmed with fairy lights, and the distant glow of the mountains beyond Asheville's edge. Her phone buzzed once on the passenger seat. A text from Shirley. You left early. Everything okay? Helen typed back with steady fingers. Everything's finally clear. By the time she pulled into her driveway, a small rental she'd barely used since moving in with Brian. The anger had cooled into something quieter, heavier. She sat in the dark for a long minute, hands resting on the steering wheel, before stepping out. The porch light flickered when she unlocked the door. Inside smelled faintly of cedar and dust. On the kitchen table sat an unopened envelope from her insurance company and a mug still ringed with old tea stains. She exhaled slowly. So this is what starting over sounds like, quiet and hollow. A knock came at the door a few minutes later. Shirley Dobbs stood there, wrapped in a fleece robe and holding a grocery bag like a shield. Got your text. Want company or just pie? Helen hesitated, then smiled faintly. Maybe both. They sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from the pie like a promise of something survivable. After a while, Shirley said, "You don't argue with trash, honey. You take out the garbage quietly." Helen's laugh came low and unexpected. "I think I just did." Shirley nodded. "Good. Now we figure out what to do with all that space they left behind." Helen looked at her hands. Steady now, palms unshaken. "I think I already know." Outside, the mountains loomed dark and certain against the sky. And somewhere between loss and resolve, Helen Carter began to imagine what she could build next. The morning sun cut through the fog, rolling off the Blue Ridge Mountains, throwing thin bands of light across Helen's windshield as she turned into the gravel drive of Pineview Storage. The air smelled of wet pine and diesel from a nearby truck. It was one of those places that looked temporary, even after years of business. Corrugated metal units lined up like obedient soldiers, roofs faded by time and weather. Helen parked beside the office. Her hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment longer than needed. She'd slept little. The night had been a blur of half-packed boxes and half-buried memories. Now she just wanted to collect her things, the few pieces left that carried the shape of her old life. Her husband's books, her mother's quilt, the table Brian built with her when he was 16. The bell over the office door jingled when she entered. The air smelled faintly of coffee and floor cleaner. A man in his 30s, thin, polite in that practiced, managerial way, looked up from behind the counter. "Morning," he said. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Helen replied, setting her purse gently on the counter. "I'm here for Unit 14B. I need to retrieve some items." He typed quickly into the computer. "Name?" "Helen Carter." His eyes flicked to the screen, then hesitated. That unit's actually closed out." Helen frowned. "That can't be right. I pay automatically every month." The man adjusted his glasses, clicking again. "It was cleared out 2 days ago. Says here it was authorized by your son, Brian Carter." The words didn't hit all at once. They seeped in like cold water. "My son?" she repeated softly, as if she might have misheard. "Yes, ma'am. He signed the release forms himself." He turned the monitor slightly so she could see a scanned signature, her son's, unmistakable. "He said he was consolidating your property." Helen felt her pulse in her throat. The small room seemed to tilt, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright. "He took everything?" The man nodded, unsure of what comfort to offer. "We just handled the paperwork, ma'am. Everything looked legitimate." Outside, the air bit at her face. She walked down the narrow lane between units until she reached the one that had been hers. 14B, padlock missing, door rolled up halfway. The inside was hollow, echoing. The concrete floor smeared with dust and faint wheel marks where boxes had been dragged. Her late husband's name, Thomas Carter, still faintly visible on a few scuffed labels. She crouched and touched the marks as though she could feel the past pressed into them. For a moment, her body wanted to fold, to cry, to curse, to drive straight to Brian's office and demand an answer. But she didn't. She stood, straightened her coat, and reached for her phone. Shirley answered on the second ring. "Helen? You sound like you swallowed ice." "They took it," Helen said. Her voice came calm, almost steady. "All of it. Thomas's books, our photos, everything." A beat of silence. Then Shirley's tone hardened. That's not family, sweetheart. That's theft. Helen's fingers tightened on the phone. Yes, she said quietly. It is. She hung up and stepped back into the unit. With her phone's camera, she began to take pictures of the empty floor, the scraped walls, the open lock. She photographed the printed receipt the manager had handed her, and the copy of Brian's digital authorization form. Each click of the camera felt like a heartbeat calming down. When she was done, she slid the door down slowly until it rattled shut. By the time she returned to her car, her reflection in the window looked different. Not older, not even sadder, but more awake. There was something behind her eyes now, a kind of quiet precision she hadn't felt since her years as a librarian when every misplaced book was a puzzle waiting to be solved. She opened her purse, pulled out a small leather notebook, and wrote 3 neat lines, items taken without consent. Proof gathered, no more warnings, her handwriting didn't tremble. As she turned the ignition, her phone buzzed with a text from Shirley. Want me to come down there? Helen looked at the empty storage yard in her rearview mirror. No, she whispered to herself. Let him think he's cleaned me out. It's better that way. The car rolled out onto the main road, sunlight glinting off the hood. Somewhere behind her, the metal doors shimmered in the light like rows of sealed secrets. By the time she reached the edge of town, the grief had settled into something smaller, colder, and far more useful. She reached for her notebook again at a stoplight and underlined her last line twice. No more warnings. The light turned green. Helen Carter drove forward, not toward home, but toward the first quiet step of her revenge. The storm arrived without warning, thick gray clouds piling over Asheville's ridge, rain tapping against Helen's window like impatient fingers. She sat at her kitchen table, the one she'd bought secondhand years ago, the one that suddenly felt too small for the weight she carried. Her laptop glowed softly in the dim room. She hadn't meant to look. Curiosity had dragged her to the local online marketplace after Shirley mentioned someone was selling antique quilts nearby. Helen had clicked on the listing out of idle instinct and froze. There it was, her grandmother's quilt, the same patchwork of crimson and cornflower blue she'd folded with her own hands last Christmas. Beneath it, a caption written with smug brevity. Vintage handmade quilt. Excellent condition. $200 OBO. Pickup only. Seller. Lana Cease. Style home. Helen's pulse tightened. She scrolled further. The oak table with the dent in the leg. Her table. The framed wedding photo of her and Thomas. Cropped to remove their faces. Sold as vintage portrait frame. Her hand hovered over the mouse, trembled once, then steadied. The rain outside deepened, drumming harder, as if keeping time with her heartbeat. Her phone buzzed. A message from Emily lit up the screen. Emily, Grandma, Mom's selling your stuff. Online. I didn't know until I saw it. I'm so sorry, Helen stared at the words. Then she typed slowly, carefully. Helen, don't be. You just showed me who they are. A few seconds later, the typing bubble appeared, then disappeared. Emily didn't reply. Helen didn't blame her. She closed her laptop and leaned back, letting the sound of the rain fill the quiet house. For a moment, she tried to remember what Thomas would have said. He'd been practical, but soft-hearted. People show their worth in how they treat the things they didn't earn, he'd once told her. That's how you know who you're really dealing with. Now she knew. The phone rang again, this time with Shirley's name flashing across the screen. Well, Shirley asked without greeting. You found it too, didn't you? Helen didn't answer right away. It's like watching someone auction off your heartbeat one photo at a time. Shirley's voice was sharp. You need to call the sheriff, Helen. This is theft, plain and simple. Helen traced a droplet sliding down the window pane with her fingertip. Not yet. Not yet, Shirley repeated, half outrage, half disbelief. What are you waiting for? Helen stood and walked to the hallway where her old filing cabinet stood. Still organized, still labeled. Every document exactly where it should be. She pulled out the manila envelope containing the storage paperwork she'd photographed yesterday. Proof, she said softly. That's what I'm waiting for. By noon, the rain had slowed to a mist. Helen drove downtown, the roads slick, autumn leaves plastered to the asphalt. She parked beside a modest brick building with a sign that read Asheville Notary and Legal Services. Inside, the office smelled of toner and peppermint. A young woman behind the counter looked up. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Helen set her documents neatly on the counter. "I need these witnessed and notarized. Every page." The woman glanced through them, eyes widening at the careful labeling and attached photographs. "This is quite thorough." Helen smiled faintly. "I used to be a librarian. I like things documented." The notary signed and stamped each sheet with a soft thunk, the sound rhythmic, final. When it was done, Helen slipped the papers into a folder and thanked her, her tone courteous but distant, like someone quietly moving their chess piece into position. Outside, the clouds were breaking. Light spilled through in fractured streaks across the wet pavement. Helen stood by her car, folder clutched to her chest, and breathed. The grief from 2 days ago was still there, but smaller now, like a shadow shrinking as the sun climbed higher. She drove home in silence, the radio off. The world felt sharper, clearer. Every signpost, every passing house seemed outlined in purpose. When she reached her driveway, she didn't go inside. Instead, she walked around to the small sunroom she used to call her reading nook. The table there was cluttered with old stationery, pencils, and sketch pads she hadn't touched in years. She sat, opened one, and began to draw. The first lines were hesitant. Simple boxes, then doors, windows, a porch. But as her pencil moved, the shape took on life. She labeled it in neat cursive at the top of the page. Property plan, to be determined. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, the page was filled with tidy sketches of a modest home surrounded by gardens and open space. A place that was hers, built not from memory, but from reclamation. Helen set the pencil down, exhaled, and whispered to the empty room, "Let them sell what's left of the past. I'm building something they'll never touch." Her phone buzzed again, a notification from the marketplace. The quilt had been marked sold. Helen smiled faintly. "Good," she murmured. "Every sale buys my freedom." She turned off the lamp, leaving the sketch spread open under the fading evening light. Outside, the clouds had cleared completely, revealing a single pale star over the mountains, sharp, defiant, and bright against the darkness. The for sale sign stood half-crooked on a patch of uneven land just outside the city limits, where the pavement surrendered to dirt, and the mountains leaned in close. The grass was waist-high in places, golden from late summer heat, and the air carried the faint hum of crickets even at midday. Helen Carter stood at the edge of it all, hands in her jacket pockets, studying the space like it might answer back. "This is it?" Shirley asked beside her, squinting through her bifocals. "It looks like a pasture that gave up." Helen smiled faintly. "That means it's quiet." A car door shut behind them. A man in a navy blazer walked up the path with the relaxed stride of someone used to explaining possibilities. "Helen Carter," he called out, extending his hand. "Alan Reed, Reed Realty. Thanks for coming out." Helen shook his hand. His palm was warm, steady. Alan looked over the lot. "Now, I'll be honest, it's not much land. Just under half an acre. Utilities are close but not connected. Bit of leveling to do before any building. But," he paused, glancing at her, "you'd own it outright." The word own landed with weight. Helen felt it in her chest. She hadn't owned anything, truly owned, since Thomas died. Not the house she'd shared with Brian, not even the storage unit with her name on it. She looked out over the wild tangle of weeds and stubborn dandelions. "What's the asking price?" Alan named a number that made Shirley wince, but Helen only nodded. She already knew what she had in savings, enough from her pension, the insurance payout, and a lifetime of never wasting money on things that didn't matter. I'll take it, she said simply. Alan blinked. You want to make an offer? No, Helen said, eyes still on the land. I want to buy it. He chuckled softly, surprised. You're not buying much land, Miss Carter, but you're buying freedom. Helen finally turned to look at him. That's all I've ever wanted. The paperwork moved quickly after that. Alan handled the formalities. Helen handled the check. She signed every document with the same tidy precision she'd used to catalog library records for 30 years. By the end of the week, she was standing again at the edge of that uneven ground, this time with the deed folded neatly in her purse. Shirley whistled low when Helen handed her the copy. Well, look at you, landowner. She slapped Helen's shoulder lightly. That plot's yours now, honey. Let's build something they can't touch. Helen smiled, the kind that started deep in her eyes. That's the plan. They spent that afternoon pacing the lot, measuring steps, sketching rough outlines in the dirt. Helen's notebook filled with diagrams, angles of light, porch dimensions, how close the road was to the oak tree that would frame her view of the mountains. Alan stopped by once during their impromptu survey, leaning against his truck with a grin. Most folks don't come this prepared, he said. I've spent my life organizing things that don't belong to me, Helen replied. This time, I'm organizing my own. Construction began 2 weeks later. The crew was small, a few locals Alan recommended, men with sunburned necks and easy humor. Helen arrived every morning at 8 sharp, coffee thermos in hand, notebook tucked under her arm. She watched every beam go up, every nail hammered in, every blueprint come alive. When the first wall rose, Shirley teared up. I can almost see it now, she whispered. A porch swing, maybe some wind chimes. Helen smiled. One step at a time. Days stretched into weeks. The smell of fresh lumber mixed with mountain air became her constant companion. She learned the rhythm of the work, the whir of saws, the scrape of shovels, the quick calls between carpenters. She'd stand there quietly, jotting notes about insulation, drainage, or porch width, as if preparing an academic report on her own rebirth. One morning, Alan stopped by again, handing her a cup of coffee. You know, he said, you're my favorite client. Most people panic halfway through a build. You just observe. Helen took the cup, smiled. Observation's a skill. You notice everything when you're ignored long enough. Alan tilted his head. You've got stories, haven't you? Plenty, she said. But I'm still writing the one that matters. When the frame finally stood solid against the setting sun, Shirley let out a whoop that startled the workers. It's real now, she said, clapping her hands. Helen stepped forward, ran her hand along the new doorway, her doorway. Yes, she murmured, it's real. Behind her, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of traffic from the highway, the world she'd left behind. Ahead of her stretched an open foundation and the promise of walls that would hold only what she chose. As the sun dipped lower, painting the lumber in shades of gold, Helen opened her notebook and wrote on a fresh page. Phase 1, complete. Build faster than regret. She underlined it twice, then closed the notebook with a quiet snap. Alan called from across the lot. You planning to name this place? Helen looked out over the empty frame, the sky turning ember red above it. I'll know it when I see it, she said. The wind picked up, swirling dust and sawdust around her boots, catching in her hair. For a brief moment, it almost sounded like applause. 6 months later, the mountains woke to a different kind of light, one that pooled across fresh paint and glinted on clean glass. Helen Carter stood in her new doorway, coffee mug in hand, and watched the sun stretch its fingers across the porch boards she'd chosen herself. Pale maple wood, smooth and warm, smelling faintly of sawdust and soap. The cottage was small, 2 bedrooms, a study, an open kitchen, but it glowed. Every wall breathed calm. Every window caught the morning sun as if it had been waiting for her all these years. Alan Reed's truck crunched up the gravel drive behind her. Well, Helen, he said, stepping out with a smile, it's done. On time, under budget, and built to outlast all of us. You happy?" Helen turned slowly, eyes soft but sharp. "Happy isn't the right word," she said. "I'm settled." Alan grinned. "That's rarer." Shirley arrived moments later, her arms loaded with a brown paper bag and a rectangular box wrapped in newspaper. "I brought cinnamon rolls and something for the doorstep," she announced. "Tradition. You can't start a new home without crumbs and laughter." Inside, the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and fresh paint. The counters gleamed, the faucet sparkled. Even the refrigerator hummed with quiet purpose. Shirley set the box on the floor, tearing away the paper to reveal a welcome mat. It read, in looping black script, "No uninvited guests." Helen laughed. A real one this time, deep and unguarded. "You do know me too well." "I do," Shirley said, smiling. "And I figured it's polite to warn people before they step inside." The two women stood at the threshold, shoulder to shoulder, watching a breeze lift a few fallen leaves across the porch. For the first time in months, Helen didn't feel small. She felt placed. Alan leaned against the railing, taking in the mountain view. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. Helen tilted her head. "You mean besides sitting on this porch and finally breathing?" He smiled. "Sure, but I also mean, what's the dream version of this? The thing you'd build if money wasn't the question." Helen considered that. Her gaze drifted toward her notebook resting on the porch table, open to sketches she'd drawn late at night, bigger plans she hadn't spoken aloud. "I've thought about something," she admitted. "A place for books, for people who still want quiet." Alan's brow lifted. "A library?" "Not just that," she said. "A little cafe, tables, reading nooks, somewhere you can breathe and belong." Alan's expression softened. "That sounds like something this town could use." The next week, Alan introduced her to a loan officer named Gwen Brooks at the local bank. A brisk woman with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses who listened more than she spoke. Helen arrived with binders, sketches, and projections printed neatly in color-coded folders. Gwen flipped through the paperwork, impressed. "You've done your homework," Helen smiled faintly. 30 years in a library teaches you how to research properly." By the time she left, the loan was approved for a modest startup, enough to convert her living room into a cafe space and build a small outdoor reading patio shaded by maple trees. The name came to her that night while she watered the saplings along her fence line. Their leaves rustled like whispers in the dusk. Maple Rest. It fit. She ordered the sign 2 days later. Maple Rest, Community Library and Cafe. By early autumn, the town buzzed with curiosity. Locals peeked in as volunteers helped her unpack donated books. Shirley managed the pastry counter, humming off key. Alan handled publicity, sending press releases to the Asheville Gazette. The morning of the opening, Helen stood outside in her favorite cardigan, a soft gray against the honey-colored siding. A banner fluttered above the door. Cars lined the gravel road. Children held paper cups of cocoa, their laughter spilling into the crisp October air. Inside, sunlight poured across shelves of used novels and cookbooks, the scent of cinnamon and brewed coffee blending with ink and paper. Someone had set a vase of wildflowers on the counter. Emily's doing. Helen had found the note tucked beneath it. "For your next chapter." Reporters drifted through, snapping photos of the warm-lit room and the woman at its center, calm, composed, completely herself. One asked for a quote. Helen paused, smiling. "Sometimes," she said, "you lose your place in one story just to write a better one." Shirley leaned over and whispered, "You're going to make the front page." Helen didn't care. What mattered was the hum of voices, the shuffle of pages, the living pulse of something she'd built with her own 2 hands. As the afternoon faded, she stepped outside with a cup of tea. Across the road, through the thinning trees, she could just make out the roof line of Brian and Lana's house. Gleaming, sterile, still. She lifted her cup slightly, as if in toast. "You said I didn't belong in your home," she murmured. "Now you don't belong in mine." The wind rustled through the maple leaves overhead, scattering a few red ones onto her welcome mat. Helen smiled down at the words, "No uninvited guests." Behind her, laughter and the smell of fresh coffee spilled out from the open door. And for the first time since she'd been told she didn't deserve a place, Helen Carter knew she had built one worth protecting. The cafe was humming, the kind of soft, low energy that made strangers speak quietly and linger longer than they planned. Steam curled from coffee cups, the scent of roasted beans mixing with cinnamon and paper. Helen stood behind the counter, arranging a vase of late-season dahlias, when the phone on the wall began to ring. She almost ignored it. Business hours were nearly over, but something about the rhythm made her pause. 3 rings, silence, 3 rings again. She wiped her hands and picked up. "Maple Rest Cafe and Library," she said evenly. "Mom." Brian's voice, familiar but thinner somehow, stripped of warmth. Helen leaned against the counter, staring through the wide front window at the maple trees swaying in the afternoon light. "Brian," she said, "it's been a while." "Yeah, listen." His voice dropped, clipped. "I heard about your project." Helen smiled faintly. "That's one word for it." "I just don't think it's wise," he continued, the words stumbling over practiced patience. "You're drawing a lot of attention. Lana's been hearing things. People are talking." "People talk," Helen said. "It's what they do when they're not busy doing." He sighed. "You don't have to make this into some public spectacle. It's creating family drama." Helen's tone stayed calm, but her spine straightened. "I don't create drama, Brian," she said softly. "I outlive it." There was silence on the line. She could almost hear him blinking, confused by her composure. "Look," he said finally, his voice hardening. "Lana thinks she thinks this whole cafe thing is a cry for sympathy. It's not a good look. You're making us all seem—" Helen didn't let him finish. "Small," she said. "You already managed that without me." He exhaled, muttered something under his breath. Then the line went dead. Helen replaced the receiver gently. Outside, the wind rustled the maple leaves, scattering gold and amber across the gravel walk. She stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet fill the space he'd tried to invade. When Shirley came in later with a tray of muffins and her usual storm of energy, she caught the look on Helen's face. "Bad call?" Helen gave a small shrug. "Just a ghost trying to haunt the living," Shirley huffed. "He'll see soon enough that you're not the one who needs saving." By evening, the cafe's rhythm picked up again. Students reading, an older couple sharing pie, a young mother helping her child pick a picture book. Helen moved among them quietly, replenishing sugar jars and straightening napkins. Each small act steadied her. Then at closing time, Shirley waved her phone. "You should see what your daughter-in-law posted." Helen frowned. "Where?" "Facebook," Shirley said, scrolling. She wrote, "Some people can't let go of being the victim. Turning a pity party into a community project doesn't make it noble, it's just sad." Helen's eyes skimmed the words once, then twice. She didn't flinch. "Let her talk," she said finally. Shirley crossed her arms. "Oh, she will, but so will I." By the next morning, the cafe's online page was flooded. Not with mockery, but with praise. Shirley had posted a glowing review with photos of the cozy interior. Then Emily added hers. "Maple Rest is my grandmother's dream come true. Every cup of coffee here tastes like peace." Other locals followed. Teachers, retirees, the sheriff's wife, even the mail carrier. "A hidden gem," one review read. "The kind of place that feels like home." By lunchtime, the cafe was full. 2 women from the newspaper's lifestyle section sat in the corner taking notes. Helen caught bits of their conversation. Her story, widowed librarian, new start. People love that sort of thing. Alan arrived mid-afternoon, brushing rain from his jacket. "Quite the crowd," he said, smiling as he took in the busy tables. "Your little project's turning into a landmark." Helen poured him a cup of coffee. "I didn't do anything dramatic. I just gave people somewhere decent to sit." Alan sipped. then gestured toward the window where new customers waited under umbrellas. "You turned their insult into income," he said. "That's art, Helen." She chuckled softly. "No, it's strategy." Alan tilted his head. "Same thing, really." As dusk fell, the last of the customers drifted out, leaving the air scented with sugar and stories. Helen walked to the porch, flipping the open sign to closed. The street beyond glowed with lamplight. She could see the faint outline of Brian and Lana's house through the trees. The windows dark, the curtains drawn. Somewhere behind those walls, she imagined them scrolling, fuming, realizing that their banishment had built her empire. Helen locked the door, exhaled, and whispered to herself, "Let them watch." The wind caught her words, carrying them out over the hills and down into town, where the chatter about Maple Rest was only growing louder. And for the first time, Helen felt not just free, but untouchable. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly inside an official white envelope stamped County of Buncombe, Department of Public Safety. Helen found it wedged between her electric bill and a flyer for pest control. The seal alone told her who was behind it. She slit the envelope open with her butter knife, while Shirley wiped down the cafe tables. The air smelled of maple syrup and coffee grounds. "Notice of inspection," Helen read aloud. "Following a citizen complaint regarding zoning and health code compliance." She looked up, lips twitching. "Citizen complaint," Shirley snorted. "Citizen my foot. I can smell that perfume of pettiness all the way from their side of the trees." Helen folded the letter once, twice, and set it calmly beside her planner. "Let them send whoever they'd like. I've got nothing to hide." The inspector arrived the next morning, punctual, pressed, and polite. A woman in her 50s with a clipboard clutched like armor and hair pinned into a perfect twist. Her name badge read, D. Merrill. "Mrs. Carter," she greeted, scanning the warm space around her. "We received a formal complaint regarding potential violations, operating beyond residential zoning, improper food handling, that sort of thing." Helen smiled softly. "Then you'd best come in and see for yourself." She led the inspector through the cafe with calm, measured grace. Every shelf was dusted. Every label was visible. The kitchen gleamed, cleaner than any restaurant Helen had ever worked in. The health permit hung laminated by the sink, her business license framed above the pastry case. The inspector adjusted her glasses, ticking boxes as she moved. "You've got your fire extinguishers up to date, food handler's certification. Even your parking area is compliant. That's impressive." "I've always believed in cataloging," Helen said mildly. "Keeps the chaos out." As they walked, Shirley appeared like a well-timed apparition, holding a plate of steaming apple pie. "You look like you skipped breakfast," she said brightly, setting it down beside the inspector's clipboard. "Try it warm. It makes paperwork go faster." Inspector Merrill hesitated, then took a small bite. Her expression softened almost instantly. "My word," she murmured. "Is that cinnamon from scratch?" "Only way to do it," Shirley said, her tone all honey. By the time they reached the back door, the inspector's posture had relaxed. She signed her final page, tore off a carbon copy, and handed it to Helen. "Complaint unfounded," she said. "Everything here is textbook. Whoever filed that must have mistaken you for someone who doesn't know what she's doing." Helen accepted the paper with a polite smile. "I get mistaken for that often," the inspector chuckled. "Keep up the good work, Mrs. Carter." When the county car pulled away, Shirley leaned against the counter, grinning. "That woman's going home with a full stomach and nothing bad to say. That's what we call a professional takedown." Helen placed the inspection report into her binder with quiet satisfaction. "No drama," she said. "Just order." That weekend, Helen hosted Maple Rest's first open mic for Goodnight. The idea had started as a note in her planner, community plus voice, X strength. But word spread quickly. By 7, the cafe was packed. Strings of fairy lights glowed along the windows. High school students read poetry. A retired mailman sang old country songs. Shirley manned the dessert counter, her laughter booming over the crowd. Helen moved between tables, shaking hands, listening, making sure every coffee cup stayed full. Cameras flashed, local press again. One of them asked her what inspired the event. She smiled for the photo, her eyes reflecting the lights above. "When people tell you to stay quiet," she said, "the best response is to hand someone else the microphone." 2 towns away, in a polished kitchen that smelled of wine and resentment, Lana scrolled through her phone, her jaw tightening with every photo she saw online. Smiling crowds, a mayoral thumbs up, Helen at the center, graceful, glowing, unstoppable. Beside her, Brian muttered something about good publicity, but Lana's silence cut through the room like glass. "Unbelievable," she said finally. "She's turning this into a circus." But on the screen, under one of the shared photos, a comment from Emily glowed bright among the hundreds of hearts and likes. "She's not turning anything into a circus. She's building something that matters." Lana tossed her phone onto the marble counter and walked away, muttering under her breath. Back at Maple Rest, Helen locked the door at midnight. The cafe was dark now, except for the lamplight catching on her inspection certificate, taped neatly to the window. She touched it once, like sealing a promise. Outside, the maples whispered under a rising breeze. Helen turned off the lights, her reflection lingering for a heartbeat in the glass. Calm, composed, victorious. "Let them file all the complaints they want," she said softly. "I'll keep passing inspection." She smiled, flipped the deadbolt, and disappeared into the warm dark. Spring came to Asheville early that year. The maples outside Maple Rest were already budding, soft green against the smoky blue mountains. Helen Carter stood on the back porch, measuring tape dangling from her wrist, squinting into the sunlight. "This porch has good bones," said Marla Jean, chair of the Asheville Artists Guild. A woman with streaks of cobalt paint in her hair and the confidence of someone who'd rebuilt things for a living. "You open this up, add a pergola, maybe a path through that patch of wildflowers, and you've got something special, a space for art, for reflection." Helen nodded, notebook in hand. "A reading garden," she murmured. "With local exhibits." Marla grinned. "Now you're speaking my language." 2 weeks later, the sound of construction filled the air again, gentler this time, like progress instead of rebirth. Volunteers from the guild worked alongside Helen, laying down gravel paths, painting benches, stringing lights. The back porch became a doorway to something more, a place that felt less like a cafe and more like a sanctuary. By the 3rd weekend, Maple Rest's new addition was ready. A curved wooden arch framed the entry, carved with the words, "Quiet minds welcome here." Beneath it, a small stone fountain bubbled softly beside shelves of free community books. Helen stood under the arch with Marla and Shirley as the local newspaper photographer snapped pictures. "Smile, ladies," he said. "You're making the front page of Sunday Living." Shirley beamed. "Well, I didn't curl my hair for nothing." Helen only smiled faintly, eyes on the garden beyond, the sunlight filtering through maple leaves, catching on sculptures and wind chimes. "This isn't just mine anymore," she said quietly. "It's everyone's." A week later, the headline appeared, "Retired Librarian Builds Haven for the Community." By Josephine Clark, Asheville Gazette. The article spread fast. It told the story of a woman who turned loss into generosity, who built a space where neighbors gathered and artists thrived. Photos showed children painting ceramic tiles, readers lounging in hammocks with books, and Helen at the center of it all, steady, serene, unbothered. Within days, the County Library Foundation called. Helen sat at her desk while Gwen from the bank read the letter aloud over the phone. "They're awarding you a grant," Gwen said, "for innovative literacy and community engagement. $10,000 to expand your programs." Helen blinked, stunned. "That's generous." "That's earned," Gwen corrected. "They don't hand these out to just anyone." Helen hung up and sat for a long moment. The letter spread before her. She'd started Maple Rest with quiet revenge in her heart. But now, It felt like something larger had taken root. Meanwhile, across town, the gossip simmered like sweet tea left in the sun. At a salon in the Grove Arcade, Lana Carter sat beneath a dryer, scrolling through her phone while her friends whispered. "You seen this article?" one asked, holding up her tablet. "That's your mother-in-law, right? She's famous now." Another leaned closer. "I heard she got some kind of government grant. They're calling her a local hero." Lana's jaw tightened. "Hero," she said flatly. Her friend laughed lightly. "Girl, your homeless mother-in-law's got better PR than anyone in town." The dryer's hum drowned out the room for a moment, but Lana could feel the heat rise, not from the machine, but from the slow burn of humiliation crawling up her neck. She forced a smile. "I'm happy for her," she lied. Later, when she got into her car, she sat for a long time with the engine running, scrolling through photo after photo of Helen smiling under banners that read, "Community Grant Recipient and Maple Rest, where stories grow." She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "Unbelievable." Back at Maple Rest, Helen walked the garden at twilight. Fireflies blinked among the flowers, their light catching the edges of newly placed sculptures. Shirley joined her, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You realize you've created something folks will be talking about for years, right?" Shirley said. Helen took a sip, eyes on the horizon. "Let them talk. That's all some people know how to do." Shirley chuckled. "You mean one person?" Helen didn't answer. Instead, she gazed at the faint lights visible through the trees across the road, the home that had once been hers in name, if not in kindness. "I wonder," she said quietly, "how long it'll take before silence becomes his answer too." As if on cue, her phone buzzed. A new message from Brian. Just 3 words. "I'm sorry, Mom." Helen stared at the screen, then turned it face down on the porch railing. "Too late," she murmured. The wind carried the scent of coffee and maple through the air, and somewhere beyond the garden fence, laughter rose from the last of the guests packing up their easels and books. Helen watched the lights flicker across the lawn and whispered to herself, "Let them see what real roots look like." The morning sunlight spilled through the windows of Maple Rest like honey, warm, unhurried, and full of promise. Helen stood behind the counter, marking off a new calendar page, when the bell over the door jingled. Emily Carter stepped inside. Her hair was pulled into a messy braid, her backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. For a moment, she looked every bit the teenager she was, half child, half woman. But her eyes carried something older. "Hey, Grandma," she said softly, trying for casual. Helen's face softened. "You're up early for a Saturday." Emily smiled shyly. "Mrs. Kemp, my school counselor, mentioned the community service program. I thought, maybe I could volunteer here, for credit." Helen's pen paused midair. She'd imagined this moment so many times, Emily walking through her door, choosing her. Still, she kept her voice steady. "You're sure your parents would be fine with that?" Emily looked down at her shoes. "Mom doesn't really ask what I do anymore, and Dad—" She trailed off, then shrugged. "He won't stop me." Helen nodded slowly. "Then yes, you can help here. We'll make it official." By noon, Emily had rolled up her sleeves and tied on an apron that read, "Maple Rest, Volunteer." Shirley nearly dropped her tray when she saw her. "Well, if this isn't the best thing I've seen all week," she said. "We've got another Carter on the schedule, one that actually works." Emily laughed. "Don't tell Mom." "Oh, honey," Shirley said with a wink. "I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of hearing my voice." The day moved easily. Emily wiped tables, helped alphabetize donated books, and chatted with customers like she'd been born into hospitality. At one point, Helen caught her laughing with a group of kids by the reading corner, her smile bright and unguarded. For the first time in years, Helen felt the house she'd built grow warmer, not just with people, but with legacy. The warmth lasted 2 days. Then came the storm. Helen was restocking muffins when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She answered, still dusting her hands with flour. The voice on the other end was cold and sharp. "You've gone too far this time." "Hello, Lana," Helen said calmly. "Don't you hello me. How dare you involve my daughter in your pity business? I just found out Emily's been working there." "She volunteered," Helen said evenly, "through her school's program. That's manipulation, and you know it. You don't get to use her for free labor and sympathy." Helen could hear the edge of panic beneath Lana's fury, a desperation disguised as control. "If you have an issue," she said, "take it up with the school counselor." "Oh, I will," Lana snapped. "And with my lawyer. You're going to regret dragging our family name through this circus." Then the line went dead. By Monday morning, the storm arrived in person. Lana marched into Maple Rest, sunglasses on, heels clicking like accusations. A few patrons turned to look. Helen didn't move from behind the counter. "Coffee?" she asked, as if greeting any customer. Lana slammed a stack of papers down. "I'll make this simple. You are to cease contact with my daughter immediately." Before Helen could answer, Alan stepped out from the office behind her. He'd been reviewing invoices, but stopped mid-step when he saw Lana. "Is there a problem here?" Lana turned, startled, but quickly gathered herself. "You must be her manager." "I'm her broker," Alan said calmly. "And friend." He picked up the papers, skimming the letterhead. "Ah, a parental demand notice. Interesting." Helen opened a drawer and took out a neatly sealed folder. "Before you go waving empty threats, Lana," she said, "you might want to read this." She slid the folder across the counter. Inside lay a signed permission slip, bearing the name Mrs. Laura Kemp, school counselor, Asheville High. Below it, the official stamp, "Approved, community service credit, Maple Rest Library and Cafe." Lana's expression froze. "It's all authorized," Helen said. "Emily's hours are logged through the school. She's insured, supervised, and protected. I'd never let her do anything unsafe." Alan smiled faintly. "Legally and morally," he said, "Helen's untouchable." Lana's eyes darted between them. For the first time, she had no words sharp enough to draw blood. She turned on her heel, muttering something about exploitation, but her voice cracked halfway through. When the door slammed shut behind her, the cafe exhaled as one. Shirley peeked out from the kitchen, eyebrows high. "Well," she said, "that woman stomps like the world owes her applause." Helen placed the folder back in its drawer. "Let her stomp. I'm done reacting." That weekend, Maple Rest hosted its first children's story hour. Emily led the event herself, her voice steady as she read aloud to a semicircle of wide-eyed kids on the garden benches. The sunlight filtered through maple leaves, dappling the pages of her book. Parents sipped coffee nearby, smiling. Helen stood off to the side with Shirley and Alan, watching quietly. "She's a natural," Alan whispered. Helen nodded, her throat tightening. "She always was." As Emily turned the page, a gentle breeze lifted the banner above the porch. "Maple Rest, all welcome who bring kindness." Helen's heart swelled as she watched the line of children forming near the reading nook, each clutching a book, waiting their turn for Emily to sign their borrowed library cards. It struck her then, not just the joy, but the symmetry. Once she'd been told she didn't deserve a place. Now she was giving everyone else one. She pressed a hand against her chest, steadying herself against the quiet rush of pride. Across the street, hidden behind drawn blinds, Lana Carter stood watching from her front window, face pale, fists tight at her sides. Inside Maple Rest, laughter rose like music. Helen didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. Her world was full, her circle unbroken, and her daughter-in-law was still standing outside. It started on a Tuesday afternoon, warm and windless, the kind of Carolina day that made people linger on porches and talk to strangers like they'd known them forever. Maple Rest was busy, the air humming with conversation and espresso steam. Helen was helping a pair of retirees pick out poetry books when the sound of screeching tires shattered the calm. Through the front windows, a black SUV rolled to a stop crookedly across two parking spaces. Lana Carter climbed out, sunglasses on, jaw tight, fury already radiating from her like static. Shirley muttered under her breath, "Well, here comes the weather." Helen didn't move from behind the counter. She'd learned by now that calm was its own kind of armor. The bell above the door jangled violently as Lana shoved it open. Heads turned. Conversations died. "You think you can just take my daughter?" she shouted, voice slicing through the cafe. "You think this charity act makes you some kind of saint?" The air went still. A toddler near the window began to cry softly before his mother scooped him up. Helen's hand stayed steady on the counter. "Emily's not taken," she said, her tone quiet but unwavering. "She's choosing where she feels safe." That only stoked the fire. "Don't you dare pretend you're some kind of victim," Lana snapped. "You're a manipulator. You've been poisoning her against us, against her father." Alan appeared in the doorway from the office, face unreadable. Shirley stepped out from the kitchen, towel slung over her shoulder like a soldier ready for battle. "Ma'am," Alan said evenly, "you're disturbing our customers." Lana turned on him, voice rising. "Don't you ma'am me. You're part of this too, aren't you?" Her little sidekick. "You're all using this place to make her look good." Phones began to lift. Quietly, discreetly at first, then not so discreetly. Customers angled their cameras toward her, screens glowing like a constellation of witnesses. Helen folded her hands. "Lana," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to slice through the noise. "You told me once I didn't deserve a place in your home, but you're standing in mine. If you're going to yell, do it outside." Gasps rippled through the room. Lana's face went crimson. "You ungrateful." "Outside," Helen repeated. "Now." For a moment, Lana looked ready to hurl the coffee mugs off the counter. But then she saw them, dozens of eyes on her, recording. She spun toward the door, muttering curses as she stormed out. The bell clanged behind her like a punctuation mark. By that evening, the video had spread across Facebook, then Reddit, then the Asheville community page. The caption read, "Local cafe owner gracefully handles public harassment from family member." The clip was short but perfect. Lana shouting, Helen standing still, poised and unmoved. The final line, "If you're going to yell, do it outside." Within hours, the comments poured in. "Queen behavior. That's Southern grace right there. Protect this woman at all costs." By morning, Maple Rest page had doubled its followers. People came not just for coffee but to see her, the woman who'd faced cruelty with calm and built something beautiful in its place. 2 days later, a county notice appeared on Lana and Brian's front door. Public disturbance citation. Fine, $200. Several neighbors had reported the incident to the sheriff's office. Lana tore the paper off the door and threw it into the trash. Brian stood behind her, quiet, pale. "This is humiliating," she hissed. "They're laughing at us." Brian stared past her toward Maple Rest, where the morning crowd already spilled onto the porch. He'd seen the video too. Emily had shown him. He'd watched it 3 times, each replay harder to stomach than the last. "Maybe," he said softly, "they're just done pretending you're right." Lana turned on him. "Don't start taking her side." He didn't answer. He just picked up his car keys. Helen was wiping down tables when the bell rang again. This time, the sound was tentative. When she looked up, Brian stood in the doorway. No sunglasses, no bluster. Just exhaustion and something close to shame. The room hushed. Shirley froze mid-step. Alan crossed his arms but didn't move. Brian stepped forward, voice unsteady. "Mom, I'm sorry," Helen didn't speak. He swallowed hard. "I should have stopped her before it got this far." "You laughed," Helen said quietly, "when she banished me from your house. You watched and laughed." He closed his eyes. "I know." She stepped closer, her voice calm but carrying the weight of years. "Then listen now." Her words seemed to hang in the air, still and electric. Brian nodded once, eyes wet, unable to speak. Around them, customers began to clap. Soft at first, then louder, until the entire cafe filled with the sound of the affirmation. Helen didn't bask in it. She simply turned, adjusted the flowers on the counter, and said, "We open at 8 tomorrow. Don't be late if you plan to help." Brian looked at her, confused. Then slowly he smiled. A small, trembling smile of someone seeing grace he didn't deserve. From the sidewalk outside, someone shouted, "We love you, Helen!" Shirley grinned. "Well," she whispered, "there's your fan club." Helen only sighed, her eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, the neighborhood that once shut her out now stood solidly behind her. And across the street, the house that had been her prison sat in silence. Lights off, curtains drawn, the echo of what they'd lost hanging heavy in the evening air. The real estate listing appeared one gray morning, tucked between an ad for garden mulch and a local news blurb about community events. Helen had been sipping her coffee at the Maple Rest counter when the headline caught her eye. 3-bedroom colonial in Asheville suburbs, motivated sellers. She didn't have to click the link to know which house it was. The address, halfway down the page, was burned into her memory. Her son's house. Their house. The place where her humiliation began. Her heart didn't race. It didn't even ache. Instead, a calm, measured pulse filled her veins, steady and cold as logic. She reached for her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. Alan answered on the second ring, his voice cheerful. "Morning, Helen. I was just thinking about stopping by for a maple scone." "I need something from you first," she said. "Oh? Name it." "I want you to handle a purchase for Maple Rest LLC," she said. Quietly. A pause, then a note of curiosity. "That's so. What kind of property?" Helen set her cup down, the sound deliberate against the counter. "The one across the street." For a moment, silence hummed between them. Then Alan's low chuckle came through the line. "You really don't miss a beat, do you?" "I don't waste them anymore," she replied. By the end of the week, the papers were signed. No drama, no headlines, no ceremony. The sale closed under Maple Rest LLC, a technicality that shielded her name from gossip. When Alan handed her the keys, he raised an eyebrow. "You own their house now. What's the plan?" Helen studied the brass keys in her palm, their weight familiar but different this time. "No revenge," she said. "Just boundaries." Shirley, standing beside her, nearly choked on her coffee. "Boundaries. Honey, that's poetic justice with a porch attached." Helen smiled faintly. "Maybe. But I'm not interested in hurting anyone. I just want to redefine what that house means." The property sat empty for weeks, blinds drawn, the yard gone wild. When Helen finally walked through the front door, the air inside smelled stale, like forgotten arguments and bleach. The echo of Lana's voice still clung to the walls, brittle and sharp. She took her time, one room at a time. The dining room, where she'd once been told she didn't deserve a place, was stripped bare. The marble counters were still cold, the chandeliers still pristine. Helen ran her hand along the edge of the table she'd once polished after family dinners, her reflection catching in its glossy surface. "This house never had a heart," she whispered. "Let's give it one." Over the next month, the renovations began. The rooms were gutted and repainted in warm tones: sage, honey, and cream. The sterile decor was replaced with shelves of donated books, handmade quilts, and local artwork. Helen hired 2 of the same carpenters who'd built Maple Rest to add small suites upstairs, each one designed for guests passing through town, traveling nurses, artists, teachers between leases. When Shirley came by to see the progress, she stopped dead in the entryway. "Lord have mercy," she said, eyes wide. "You've turned a mausoleum into a miracle." Helen chuckled softly. "It's just a house, Shirley." "Not anymore," Shirley said. "Now it's a second chance." They stood together on the porch as evening fell, the scent of lilacs drifting from the newly planted garden. Across the street, Maple Rest's lights glowed warm through the trees, home facing home, peace facing what used to be pain. One Saturday, a new sign appeared beside the mailbox, simple, white, and neatly lettered. Carter, for visitors only. Neighbors noticed. Some smiled, others whispered. Helen didn't explain it. She didn't have to. The people who mattered already understood. A week later, a local teacher checked in for a month-long stay. The first guest. Then came a retired veteran, then a traveling nurse. Word spread. Helen called it the Carter House Guest Program, a quiet extension of Maple Rest's community work. Alan dropped by one evening with takeout and watched the sunset from the new porch swing. "You realize," he said, "you've built something that outlasts resentment." Helen leaned back, eyes on the fading sky. "Resentment rots fast," she said. "But purpose keeps." Across the road, the old neighborhood shimmered under the twilight. The porch lights of Maple Rest and the renovated Carter House glowed like two steady beacons. Past and present finally aligned, both hers. As night settled, Helen walked down the gravel path to the road. A breeze lifted her hair as she looked at the two signs across from each other. Maple Rest, all welcome who bring kindness. Carter, for visitors only. Her lips curved into a quiet, knowing smile. The world had shifted, not with fury, but with symmetry. And somewhere, she thought, Lana would see the listing online, recognize the address, and understand the one thing Helen had never said aloud. You can't reclaim what you never valued. Helen turned back toward the porch, lights glowing behind her, and whispered, "Now it's truly mine." The first frost arrived early that year, painting the maples in silver dust. Helen stood outside Maple Rest just after dawn, sweeping leaves from the porch. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and roasted coffee. Her kind of morning, quiet and sure. She didn't notice the car until she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A dark sedan, older model, pulled into the lot and idled. When the door opened, Brian stepped out. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched, his eyes red-rimmed from nights that hadn't known rest. "Mom," he called, voice hesitant. Helen straightened but didn't move closer. "Brian?" He walked up the path, hands deep in his coat pockets like a boy who'd come home from school with bad grades. The silence between them stretched thin. "I didn't know where else to go," he said finally. "You had plenty of places once," she replied. "You just didn't see me among them." He nodded, swallowing. "I deserve that." Helen set the broom aside and gestured toward one of the cafe chairs on the porch. "Sit if you're staying long enough to talk." He did. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the wind answered, carrying the faint chatter of morning birds. "Lana's gone," Brian said at last, the words spilling out like confession. "She left about a month ago, took the car, the savings, everything she could. Said she was tired of living in someone else's shadow." Helen arched a brow. "Whose shadow was that?" He gave a weak laugh that turned into a sigh. "Yours, I guess. She couldn't stand that people respected you, that no matter what she said, they still loved you here." He rubbed his forehead. "I lost the house after she left. The bank took it before I even figured out how to stop them." Helen tilted her head slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "I know." His eyes lifted to hers. You know? "I bought it, Brian." The color drained from his face. "You, what?" "Through Maple Rest," she said. "It's guest housing now. People stay there when they need a place to land." He stared at her as if trying to reconcile the mother he remembered with the woman in front of him. "You turned our house into a charity." "I turned your house into something useful," she corrected softly. "Mine was already taken from me once. I learned to build better this time." Brian pressed his hands to his face. His voice came muffled. "I don't know how to make this right." Helen took a slow sip of coffee from her thermos, the steam rising between them like a veil. "Start by not trying to fix what isn't broken. I have peace now, Brian. I worked for it." He looked up, eyes glassy. "I'm not asking for much. I just need somewhere to stay until I get back on my feet." Helen's expression softened, but only slightly. "You're welcome to volunteer here," she said, but not to live here. He flinched as though she'd struck him, then nodded, tears welling but unshed. I deserve that too. This isn't punishment, she said. It's clarity. You laughed when I was thrown out of that house. Now you're standing in front of mine. Do you understand the difference? He looked around, the porch, the open windows glowing with warm light, the laughter of customers filtering out. Then he met her eyes. Yeah, he said hoarsely. I do. Helen stood, adjusting her scarf as a group of regulars waved from the sidewalk. You can start by helping Shirley set up for the morning rush. She'll find you a broom. Brian nodded, wiping his face quickly. Thank you, Mom. Don't thank me yet, she said, turning toward the door. Just do better. An hour later, Helen watched from the counter as Brian worked quietly beside Shirley, sweeping the porch she'd swept herself earlier. He was awkward, uncertain, like a man relearning how to move through decency. Alan leaned over and murmured, Looks like Repentance finally found a job. Helen smiled faintly. It's about time it started paying wages. Outside, the frost began to melt under the morning sun. The porch boards glistened, wet and shining as Brian worked. Helen watched him for a long moment, long enough to see him straighten, stretch his shoulders, and glance toward Maple Rest's sign. Her eyes softened, but her hands stayed steady as she poured another cup of coffee. Across the street, a new guest was checking into the Carter house. The past and the present stood there, side by side, quiet and complete. Helen whispered to herself, Let him learn peace the hard way. It's the only way that lasts. She turned back to her customers, the bell over the door chiming in rhythm with her heartbeat, measured, unbroken, free. The envelope arrived on a rain-slick morning, thick and heavy with legal weight. Helen found it waiting on Maple Rest's counter beside the day's pastry order, its bold, blocky return address impossible to miss. Law offices of Hammond and Burke. Shirley noticed her pause. That the fancy kind of envelope or the foolish kind? Helen slid it open with her butter knife. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines. Then she sighed, a long, quiet exhale that sounded almost amused. Foolish, she said. Very. It was official notice. Lana Carter versus Maple Rest, LLC. The claim alleged unauthorized use of family property, emotional distress, and, Helen almost laughed, misappropriation of familial legacy. Shirley leaned over the counter, reading upside down. Lord help me, that woman's trying to sue you for buying a house she lost herself. Helen folded the papers neatly and set them aside. She's trying to rewrite history, but history has receipts. That afternoon, Alan arrived, raincoat dripping, carrying a file folder. I heard from the courthouse, he said. Don't panic. I already called someone, Gordon Ellis. He's the best real estate litigator in the county. Smart, clean, relentless. You'll like him, Helen smiled faintly. Anyone who doesn't flinch under pressure sounds like my kind of company. Alan grinned. Oh, he's more than that. He's surgical. 2 days later, Helen met Gordon Ellis in his downtown office, a small wood-paneled space that smelled faintly of rain and leather. He was a trim man in his 60s with steady eyes and a calm voice that never once rose above conversational volume. Mrs. Carter, he said, shaking her hand firmly. I've read every word of her claim. I'll be honest, it's made of air and arrogance. Helen chuckled softly. Both in strong supply. He smiled. Then this will be quick. Within weeks, Gordon filed a counterclaim. Proof of purchase, business registration, bank transfers, all in Helen's name through Maple Rest, LLC. Lana had no signature, no contract, no financial stake. Just fury wrapped in entitlement. She'll try to drag it out, Gordon warned her during one meeting. But the law doesn't care about bruised pride. Helen's eyes twinkled. It never did when it was mine. The court date came in early spring, when the air smelled of thawing earth and daffodils pushing through wet soil. Helen dressed simply, gray slacks, navy sweater, no jewelry but her wedding band. Lana arrived with her attorney, a younger man whose confidence outpaced his competence. She wore a cream suit and an expression rehearsed for sympathy. Across the courtroom, Emily sat beside Alan and Shirley, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She'd insisted on being there. "I want to see her finally told no," she'd said. When the judge entered, the room quieted. The case was short, barely 40 minutes. Gordon spoke plainly, clearly, using documents instead of dramatics. Lana's attorney blustered, pivoted, and finally wilted under the weight of evidence. At last the judge adjusted her glasses, eyes moving from one woman to the other. "Mrs. Carter," she said to Helen, "your documentation is impeccable." "Mrs. Carter," turning to Lana now, "you have no standing. The property was legally purchased, all filings transparent. This court dismisses your claim with prejudice." Lana blinked, her mouth opening, then closing again. And the judge continued, "You are ordered to pay the defendant's legal fees in full." The gavel struck. Helen didn't smile. She simply gathered her papers, nodded once at the judge, and turned to leave. As she passed Lana's table, she paused just long enough to say, "Next time, bring truth. It travels farther than temper." By the next morning, the Asheville Gazette ran the headline in bold, "Woman reclaims life after family betrayal. Local librarian wins lawsuit against former in-laws, turns loss into legacy." Photos showed Helen outside Maple Rest, sunlight catching the silver in her hair. She looked calm, almost regal. Shirley clipped the article, framed it, and hung it near the register. "For posterity," she said. Alan winked. "For Lana's ulcers, more like." Helen only shook her head. "For Emily." That weekend, Emily arrived with a duffel bag. "Dad said it's fine if I stay part-time," she said, hesitating in the doorway. "Help out at Maple Rest, and maybe the guest house too." Helen smiled. "The Carter house always has a room for people who build instead of break." As they unpacked together, Helen watched her granddaughter arrange books on a shelf. The same books that had once been hers, rescued from the storage betrayal long ago. It felt at last like everything had come full circle. When evening fell, they sat on the porch with Shirley and Alan, watching the first fireflies flicker over the garden. Emily broke the quiet. "Grandma, do you ever think about what she said that day at dinner?" Helen took a slow sip of tea, her gaze drifting toward the glowing sign across the street. "She said I didn't belong in their home," Helen replied. "Now they don't belong in mine." The words weren't bitter. They were balanced, like the closing line of a story told exactly as it needed to be. Alan nodded softly. "You know, you didn't just win a case, Helen. You won the narrative." Helen smiled faintly. "No," she said, looking at the horizon where the last light was fading. "I just wrote the truth down and let it defend itself." The porch fell quiet again. Fireflies blinked in the dusk like slow applause. And across the street, the Carter house's porch light flicked on. Another guest arriving, another story beginning. Helen leaned back in her chair, a breeze tugging at her sleeve. "Peace," she whispered, "is the best verdict there is." The evening air in Asheville carried the faint scent of rain and lilacs as Helen Carter walked up the marble steps of City Hall. The banners overhead fluttered with civic pride, community spirit awards, honoring local changemakers. Helen adjusted the small silver pin on her cardigan, the one shaped like an open book. She'd worn it for 30 years at the library and again today, out of habit and quiet symbolism. The marble foyer shimmered with polished light as people filled the auditorium. Neighbors, small business owners, volunteers, even a few journalists with their cameras ready. Alan met her near the stage, his tie slightly crooked, his grin warm. "You ready to charm an entire city again?" Helen smiled. "I don't think cities need charming. They just need reminding." From the front row, Shirley waved like a lighthouse, Emily beside her in a blue dress that matched her eyes. "You better say something quotable," Shirley called out as Helen passed. "I brought tissues just in case." Helen chuckled softly. You always do. When her name was called, Helen Carter, founder of Maple Rest Community Library and Cafe, the applause came in a swell that startled her. She wasn't used to that kind of sound directed at her. For years, silence had been her companion, then whispers of pity, and finally, peace. But applause? That felt foreign. She stepped up to the podium, the warm light catching the silver in her hair. The microphone squeaked once, then stilled. Helen took a breath, glanced at the crowd, and spoke in the even, deliberate rhythm that had always commanded quiet in a library. I wasn't planning to say much, she began, because most good stories don't need explanations. They just need truth. The audience leaned in. Maple Rest started because I needed a place to sit down, she said, smiling faintly. Then it became a place where others could stand up, for one another, for kindness, for second chances. Sometimes we don't plan to build something bigger than ourselves. It just happens when life hands us smaller rooms than we deserve. She paused, letting the quiet settle. I was told once that I didn't deserve a place in someone else's home. That kind of sentence can hollow you out if you let it. But here's the thing. Sometimes the people who close their doors make room for bigger rooms you were meant to build all along. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Soft, emotional, collective understanding. Helen's voice stayed steady. I learned that community isn't about ownership. It's about invitation. Every hand that shelved a book, poured coffee, or read a story at Maple Rest made it what it is today. This award isn't mine. It's everyone's who believed that belonging doesn't need permission. She glanced toward the front row, where Emily's eyes shimmered under the lights. And to those who think loss is the end of a story, it isn't. It's just the page where the ink finally gets interesting. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then applause erupted, loud, rising, sustained. A standing ovation filled the chamber, echoing off the marble walls like a tide. Helen stood still at the podium, overwhelmed but composed, a smile ghosting across her lips. She didn't bow. She simply nodded, eyes wet, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the lectern as if steadying a heartbeat. Afterward, reporters surrounded her briefly, snapping photos as the mayor shook her hand. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, "you've done more for this town's soul than most of us do for its roads." Helen chuckled softly. "Both need maintenance," Shirley intercepted next, wiping at her eyes despite herself. "I told you I'd need the tissues," she sniffed. "And they said you didn't deserve a place." Helen squeezed her friend's hand. "Turns out I just needed to build one big enough for everyone else." Emily stepped forward then, clutching the engraved plaque they'd handed over. A simple oak frame, gold letters gleaming under the overhead lights. Without a word, she hugged her grandmother, burying her face into Helen's shoulder. Helen held her close, whispering, "You're my best chapter, sweetheart." When Emily finally pulled back, her cheeks were wet but smiling. "Grandma, you made an entire city cry." Helen smiled, eyes soft with pride. Just reminded them they're part of the story. Outside, the rain had started again, light and misty. Helen, Alan, Shirley, and Emily stood on the City Hall steps beneath the street lamps. The award gleamed faintly in Helen's hands. Alan looked up at the banner still flapping above the entrance. "You realize they'll want to name something after you next," he teased. Helen laughed quietly. "They can name a bench if they like. Somewhere people can sit and think before they speak," Shirley grinned. Classic Helen. Build peace, one seat at a time. As they started down the steps, a passerby called out from across the street, "Congratulations, Miss Carter. Maple Rest changed this town." Helen turned, smiled, and waved. "It changed me first," she said softly. The rain deepened, silvering the pavement. She looked toward the distant line of maples glowing under the streetlights, the leaves shimmering like applause. Her home waited just beyond them, the cafe, the garden, the laughter, all she'd built from the ashes of rejection. Helen Carter drew a long breath of the damp night air and whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "It's not about being invited anymore. It's about belonging." And as thunder rolled softly over the mountains, she smiled. The storm, once her undoing, was now just the sound of everything she'd survived learning to clap. Morning sunlight sifted through the maples, painting gold over the front porch of Maple Rest. The air smelled of wet soil, sugar, and coffee, the scent of a life rebuilt from splinters and silence. Helen Carter sat at her kitchen table, the hum of the early cafe drifting faintly through the walls. Laughter, a milk steamer, the faint clatter of mugs. A white envelope lay before her, no return address, just her name in a familiar, hesitant handwriting. She'd recognized it instantly, Brian's. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. The kettle hissed softly behind her, the sound patient and unjudging. Finally, she slit the envelope open, the paper whispering like a secret too late to change. His handwriting wobbled, uneven but careful. Mom, I don't know how to say sorry in a way that can reach what I broke. Lana's gone for good. I thought losing her would make things feel lighter, but it just made the quiet louder. The truth is, I was weak. You raised me better than that. I stood by when I should have stood up. You didn't deserve what we did to you. Nobody does. I see now what you built. Everyone does. They talk about Maple Rest, like it's a miracle. Maybe it is. Maybe you were always building miracles, and I was too blind to notice. If you can't forgive me, I understand. But I needed you to know, I see you now. I'm proud of you. Love. Brian. Helen read it twice, then folded the letter neatly, her eyes dry but her throat tight. She stood and crossed the room to a small wooden cabinet by her desk, her personal archive. Inside were folders labeled in her tidy handwriting. Permits, designs, grants, letters, receipts. And one, set apart from the rest, labeled Lessons. She slipped the envelope inside and shut the drawer with a quiet click. No ceremony, no bitterness. Just filing the past where it belonged. Preserved, but powerless. Outside, the garden called. Maple Rest was in full bloom. The back garden hummed with life. Bees hovering over marigolds, the rustle of pages as children read on benches beneath the trees. Emily was leading them today, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of a story. And when the little fox found her den again, she read. She realized home wasn't where she'd been, but where she'd become. Helen lingered near the porch, watching. She could still see traces of the woman she used to be in her granddaughter's poise. The careful diction, the calm smile, the gentleness that hid steel underneath. Morning boss lady, Shirley called, emerging from the cafe with 2 mugs in hand. Brought you the strong stuff. Helen smiled, accepting the cup. How many cups of strong stuff have you had? Shirley laughed, plopping down beside her on the porch bench. Enough to run this place twice over. And still not enough to get used to what you've done here. Helen tilted her head. What's that supposed to mean? Shirley gestured toward the garden, the reading circle, the art display under the pergola. The hum of conversation drifting from the cafe doors. You did it, Helen. You built your peace, not revenge, not noise, peace, the kind that can't be taken back. Helen looked down at her coffee, steam curling like memory. Maybe that was the revenge, she said softly. Peace in a world that expected me to crumble. Shirley nodded, her voice low. And look at you now, rock solid with a coffee bar. They both laughed quietly. From across the garden, Emily waved, the book still in her hand. Helen raised her mug in return, pride blooming in her chest like spring after a long, hard winter. As the afternoon light softened, Helen walked alone to the front gate. The breeze carried the faint sound of a child's laughter, mingling with the chime of the cafe's doorbell. She paused at the wooden sign beside the walkway, tracing her fingers over the carved words she'd chosen long ago. Maple Rest, all welcome who bring kindness. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the varnished wood. The years had traced fine lines across her face, but her eyes were still sharp, still certain. She thought of all the versions of herself that had led here, the one who was banished, the one who grieved, the one who planned, the one who built. Every one of them had a hand in this piece. Shirley's voice called faintly from the porch. "Helen, you coming in for supper?" "In a minute," she called back. She stood there a little longer, watching as the sun dipped behind the maples, their leaves catching fire in the golden light. Somewhere in town, someone was probably still telling the story about the woman who lost her family and found her purpose. Helen smiled to herself. A small, satisfied curve of the lips. "My daughter-in-law said I didn't deserve a place in their lives," she murmured, voice low but steady. "So I built a life she'll never step inside." The wind stirred, gentle but sure, carrying the scent of coffee, lilacs, and something new, something earned. Helen turned, the cafe lights glowing behind her like a promise, and walked home through the garden she'd planted from every wound she'd ever survived.